Story number 1. I always thought Airbnb stays were simple and safe, a home away from home. That belief crumbled during my last trip to a quaint seaside town. I rented a cozy 2-story house near the beach, perfect for a solo traveler like me. The owner, Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly lady, assured me of a peaceful stay. Little did I know, peace was the last thing I'd find there. On the first night, everything seemed normal. The ocean's distant roar was soothing, lulling me into a sense of security as I drifted off to sleep in the soft bed. But my tranquility was short-lived. Around midnight, I woke to a strange, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but in the dead of night, it echoed through the silent house. I thought maybe it was a branch against the window. A simple explanation, right? Summoning courage, I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the window. Nothing. The trees were still, the night air calm. Confused, I returned to bed, attributing the noise to my imagination, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the tapping resumed. Clearer now, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone, considering calling Mrs. Thompson. But what would I say? That I was scared of a noise? Instead, I decided to investigate, a decision I'd soon regret. The house felt different in the dark, with shadows lurking in every corner, turning familiar furniture into ominous silhouettes. As I descended the stairs, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the living room. I reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. Gathering every ounce of bravery, I stepped into the living room. That's when I saw it, the front door, slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Panic surged through me. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or worse, was someone in the house? My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Every horror story I'd ever heard played in my head. I approached the door, my hands trembling, and shut it firmly, locking it this time. I turned around to head back upstairs, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, coming from the kitchen. Frozen in fear, I listened as the whisper grew into a low, guttural growl. Someone, or something, was in the house with me. I should have run and called for help, but my feet wouldn't move. I was a statue, gripped by an icy fear. The growl turned into a snarl, and then I saw it, a shadowy figure, creeping along the kitchen floor. It was too dark to make out any features, but it was unmistakably human, or so I thought. I mustered the courage to move, sprinting upstairs to the safety of the bedroom. I locked the door behind me and pushed a chair against it. My heart was a drum in my chest, my breath ragged with fear. I dialed 911, whispering my predicament into the phone. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline. They assured me help was on the way. As I waited, the growling from downstairs ceased. Silence enveloped the house again, a silence more terrifying than any noise. The police arrived minutes later, but found no one. No signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen or out of place. They suggested it might have been a stray animal, but I knew what I heard wasn't any animal. I left the Airbnb the next morning, vowing never to return. The memory of that night haunts me. Who or what was in that house with me? I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for sure. I'll never stay alone in an Airbnb again. Story number 2. As a travel writer, I'm no stranger to staying in various accommodations, but my experience at a historic Airbnb in an old mountain town was unlike any other. The house, an elegant, yet time-worn Victorian estate, was managed by a friendly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove. They shared tales of the town's rich history and the house's past as a grand family home. Their only advice, Don't mind if things seem a bit off. This old house has its quirks. The first day was enchanting, filled with explorations of cobbled streets and local lore. The house itself was a maze of corridors and antique-filled rooms, each whispering stories of a bygone era. However, it was the second night when the extraordinary happened. I was awakened by the sound of footsteps pacing outside my room. Assuming it was Mr. Hargrove, I ignored it at first, but the pacing continued, growing more frantic. Curiosity overcame me, and I decided to investigate. As I opened my door, the sound abruptly stopped. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. Shrugging off the unease, I returned to bed. But just as I began to drift off, the pacing resumed, this time accompanied by a soft whispering. This time, when I stepped into the hallway, I saw him. A figure at the far end of the corridor, dressed in period clothing, his back to me. He seemed out of place, like a character stepped out of a history book. I called out, but he didn't respond, continuing his restless pacing. As I cautiously approached, the figure turned and walked into one of the rooms. I followed, only to find the room empty, with no sign of the mysterious guest. Perplexed and unnerved, I returned to my room, eventually falling into a restless sleep. In the morning, I mentioned the incident to the Hargroves. They exchanged a knowing look before Mrs. Hargrove gently explained that previous guests had reported similar occurrences. Legend had it that the house was still inhabited by the spirit of a former resident, a young man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The Hargroves believed the spirit meant no harm, simply replaying his last moments in the house he loved. While intrigued by the story, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of sharing the space with an unseen presence. For the remainder of my stay, the nocturnal pacing continued, each night a reminder of the house's hidden history. Though I never felt threatened, the experience left me with a profound sense of the past's proximity. An eerie reminder that some guests, even after leaving, never truly depart. Story number 3. As an avid traveler, I've always enjoyed the adventure and spontaneity of staying in different Airbnbs. This time, my journey brought me to a charming cottage in a small coastal town. The host, a friendly lady named Anne, welcomed me with stories about the local area and a reminder to lock the doors at night due to recent petty thefts in the neighborhood. I thanked her, not overly concerned, as the town seemed peaceful enough. The cottage was delightful, with a cozy fireplace and a view of the sea. The first day passed in blissful exploration of the sandy beaches and quaint shops. As night fell, I returned to the cottage, made a small dinner, and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the distant sound of waves. However, my peaceful sleep was abruptly interrupted in the early hours of the morning. I was startled awake by the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart pounded as I strained my ears, hearing the muffled sounds of footsteps in the living room. I remembered Anne's warning about thefts and realized with a sinking feeling that a thief must have broken in. Quietly, I got out of bed and tiptoed to the bedroom door. Through the crack, I could see a figure rummaging through my belongings in the living room. The intruder seemed hurried, stuffing items into a bag. I knew I had to act. I quietly dialed the local police, whispering my situation and the cottage's location. As I spoke with the dispatcher, the intruder, perhaps sensing my movement, abruptly stopped and looked towards the bedroom. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I saw that he was not a seasoned criminal, but a young man, probably no older than a teenager, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way. The young man seemed to panic, dropping the bag and stumbling towards the door. Before he fled, our eyes met again, and in that brief moment, I saw not malice, but regret and a deep-seated fear. The police arrived minutes later, but the young intruder was gone, disappearing into the night. They found my belongings scattered near the door, nothing taken. Anne arrived soon after, apologetic and concerned. She mentioned the boy might be a local who had recently fallen into bad company and alcohol. Despite the ordeal, I felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. The incident left me unsettled, but it also gave me a glimpse into the struggles that some faced in this seemingly peaceful town. I continued my stay, but with a newfound awareness of the hidden layers beneath the surface of each destination I visited. The incident at the cottage remained with me, a reminder of the complex tapestry of human experiences that often go unnoticed in our travels. Story number 4. I had always preferred the unique charm of an Airbnb in comparison to the impersonality of a hotel. This preference led me to a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from the city's bustle. The owner, a solitary man named Mr. Grayson, offered a brief tour, his demeanor polite but distant. The cabin, surrounded by dense forest, promised a peaceful retreat. The first night was as tranquil as I had hoped. I spent the evening by the fireplace, lost in a book, the only sounds being the crackling fire and the occasional hooting of an owl. Satisfied, I retired to bed, looking forward to a week of solitude. However, the serenity of the first night was short-lived. On the second night, I awoke to the faint sound of footsteps outside my bedroom. Initially, I assumed it was just an animal, a common occurrence in such a remote location. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the sounds were too heavy, too deliberate to be an animal. Heart racing, I quietly got out of bed and tiptoed to the door. The footsteps continued, moving through the living room, then stopping abruptly. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be Mr. Grayson? But why would he enter unannounced at such a late hour? I reached for the phone to call for help, but then I remembered Mr. Grayson's warning about the spotty reception in the area. I felt a surge of panic, realizing I was entirely on my own. Gathering my courage, I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The cabin was dark and silent, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. I moved cautiously towards the living room, my senses heightened. As I entered the room, I saw him, a figure standing by the window, his back to me, staring out into the darkness. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence menacing in the moonlit room. I froze, unsure of what to do next. The stranger turned slowly, and I braced myself for a confrontation. But to my shock, his face was hidden in shadow, unrecognizable. Before I could react, he moved towards the door and left the cabin, his departure as silent as his arrival. In the morning, I contacted Mr. Grayson, recounting the night's events. His reaction was one of disbelief, then concern. He insisted no one else had access to the cabin and suggested it might have been a drifter, not an uncommon occurrence in the area. Despite Mr. Grayson's assurances, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. The image of the stranger's shadowed face haunted me. I decided to cut my stay short, leaving the cabin and its unseen guest behind. To this day, I wonder about the identity of the stranger and his purpose in the cabin that night. The experience left me with an unsettling realization. Sometimes, the isolation we seek can bring us face to face with the unknown. Story number 5. I've always had a knack for finding unique and offbeat places to stay during my travels. That's how I ended up at a quaint Airbnb in a remote coastal town. The house, a charming old structure with a view of the sea, was run by a young couple, Lucas and Mia. They seemed friendly, if a bit anxious, as they handed me the keys and quickly left. The house had an air of neglect, but its rustic charm was undeniable. The first day passed peacefully as I explored the nearby beaches and enjoyed the solitude. As night fell, the sound of the sea was a soothing backdrop as I settled in, but something strange happened on the second night. I was awakened by the sound of the front door creaking open. Startled, I sat up in bed, listening intently. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. I thought of calling out, but something held me back, a sense of foreboding that filled the air. Silently, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the doorway. Peeking out, I saw a figure moving in the dim moonlight, a shadowy presence that seemed both foreign and oddly familiar. The figure paused, as if sensing my presence, then continued towards the living room. Heart pounding, I followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. The figure, a man, was rummaging through the drawers in the living room, his movements frantic yet silent. I strained to see his face, but it was shrouded in darkness. I thought about facing him, but he seemed scary, so I went back to my room quietly and locked the door. Then I called the police and quietly told them what was happening. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the intruder was gone. They found no sign of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The officers suggested it might have been someone with a key, perhaps a previous guest, or even the hosts themselves. Lucas and Mia were shocked when I told them what happened. They insisted they had no idea who it could be, but I noticed a flicker of recognition in Lucas's eyes that he quickly masked. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease, so I decided to leave the next day. But as I packed my bags, I found something chilling, a small, old photograph tucked under my pillow. It was a picture of the house, dated several decades back. Standing in front of it was a young man. His face looked a lot like the intruder I saw. The young couple had no explanation for the photograph, and their discomfort was palpable. I left with more questions than answers. Who was the man in the picture, and why had he come to the house that night? The mystery remained unsolved, but one thing was clear. I had been an unwitting participant in a story that stretched far beyond my brief stay.